well, as I mentioned, we'll probably get this webinar on the road now. First and foremost, thank you all for attending, and I hope everyone's having a good day today. So what we're going to do is dive into what is hopefully, or what we are planning on turning into a new series called the Efficient KeyShot User. And the whole idea here is to focus on areas that can really up everybody's game regardless of their level of experience within KeyShot. So that's what we're going to do, and we're going to begin with materials. So rather than getting into how to actually build specific materials, we're actually going to be talking about all the tools and features within KeyShot that relate to materials or managing materials within your KeyShot scene. So the idea is to take you up to a higher level of a KeyShot user. Oops. Now, before we start this webinar, we are going to mention a few things that we typically point out, and that is that this is going to be recorded and it will be available for watching on our YouTube channel later. That is youtube.com/KeyShot3D. And as far as the machine, we're actually working on a 2013 Mac Pro. It's got 8 cores in it, and those run at 3 gigahertz. And if you have questions throughout this presentation or webinar, just feel free to throw those into the questions in the GoToWebinar control panel, and either Josh or Rex will answer those during the presentation. And I will mention that we will have a Q&A at the end of the presentation in which your questions can be answered by myself or somebody else on the call. Now, as far as the actual topics that we're going to dive into today is touching on what the series is about, and then a brief run through custom directories, the color picker tool, and all of the little details that are jammed into that tool, our in-project material list, how to link and unlink materials, and some tips and tricks there, isolating materials to a selection, saving materials, using multi-materials, and how linked materials behave within model sets, as well as material templates, some pro features at the end. But what's nice here is, again, you can see a pretty good split between features that are available to everybody, regardless of their KeyShot license, as well as pro level users. And of course, we'll finish with a Q&A at the end. Hopefully we'll have roughly 10 minutes to do that. So getting into this first slide here, as mentioned before, this Efficient KeyShot User series, anyone can pick up KeyShot and work through a scene, thankfully, because of its lightweight, very simple, user-friendly interface. But it takes some higher level of understanding to become a KeyShot ninja, and this is getting into proficiency and speed, so working more intelligently as well as faster. And we also want to do things like reduce rework, which means having KeyShot, setting up your scenes and rendering out assets that allow you to work more flexibly and non-destructively, as well as improving the quality of the working files, whether you are working on something that was an older file that you then open down the road and then have to make tweaks to, or perhaps handing off the file to somebody else, or opening up somebody else's archived files. We want to keep our working files in good order. So we're going to touch on all these during today's presentation. Also, before I get into this, I should say I will, as far as the format goes, I will be bouncing back and forth between KeyShot and the presentation, as opposed to running through the presentation first and then diving into the hands-on section. All right, the first thing we want to talk about here is custom directories. So what does this mean? And basically in KeyShot, you have a default location where all of the assets within your KeyShot library is saved. We call this the KeyShot directory. It's going to be in your user documents folder within a PC, and then within your app data folder on a Mac platform. So what we can do, though, is go into our preferences and change the location for this material library. And the reason you might want to do this is to extend the number of users who can access that exact collection of assets, as well as sharing those with within a team, or being able to access those from multiple machines. It also makes it easy to migrate these from one version of KeyShot to another if you're doing an upgrade. And you can also then control access or permissions as to who can download or I guess access these materials or write to that folder. So we're going to take a look at how we do that within KeyShot real quick. So in here, I'm going to switch to my other studio. Here we go. So we have this awesome little wristwatch here. And if I were to go into my preferences here, in my case, it's going to be under KeyShot, then Preferences. If you're on a PC, you're going to go into Edit and then Preferences. Once we're inside here, on the left-hand side, we see 3 levels down from the top, a section called Folders. This is going to show us where the KeyShot directory is, and we can see here where the path on this machine. And if we want to then tell KeyShot to look in alternative or additional locations for materials, I would choose this option down here, Customize each folder. Now, this doesn't mean we have to go and manage each one of these actively. We can go in and make a change to just one of these if we want to. In our example here, materials is what I would be looking to change. So I would hit this Browse Folder icon. This shows us where we're currently looking for these materials. If I want to add another location, of course, I just hit the plus sign, and then I would browse on this machine, hitting the folder once more, and go ahead and look at other locations. I could indeed choose, say, the desktop or something like that, or I could go into a shared network location if I had teammates who I wanted to be able to access as well, and each user who would then be accessing those assets would want to follow the same process. And once they do so, you can decide on whether or not they have read-only or read and write permissions. And you can also make this the default location if you wish to as well. Again, I'm not actually going to do this today, but I just want to show you where it is. Once you add a secondary location, it becomes another line item right here with a little summary as to whether it's read-only or not. And you can continue this process as many times as you wish. Now, once we get into the materials section, if I collapse the materials folder, you will see we have our downloads folder, our materials folder, and then had I added another destination, we would see a hard line underneath materials, and then we would see another folder with the option to expand if you have subfolders, and then all the materials inside it. And this is, again, a great way if you want to have multiple directories or locations, maybe just your custom materials as well, you could do that. So definitely, that's the first item I wanted to touch on here. Now, the next item is deceptively simple. Most people go, oh, it's a color picker tool. You can just pick a color. Great. But actually, we have a lot of functionality inside this tool that allows you to, again, just work quicker and more concisely or precisely, I suppose. So the first recommendation I have is to use the HSV color space when picking or creating colors. When you first install KeyShot, it's going to give you the RGB color space, and again, I will show you how to change that. Next, we have the temporary color holding palette, and this is where you can save swatches for future use. We have an eyedropper tool, which allows you to sample colors, and we also have a nifty version of the eyedropper tool that allows you to find the nearest perceptual colors within a specified folder using a reverse color lookup. So I'm going to show you what all that means here in just a moment. Switch on over back to KeyShot. Okay, so a couple things here. Let's open up that color picker real quick. So when you double click on a material within your real-time view, of course, we are presented with the material properties on the right-hand side. Now, I'm going to go ahead and filter this down real quick. We're going to come back to what we're looking at here. Okay. Now, up top here, we're looking at this matte black plastic material. And of course, when I click on the palette here, we get a color picker. And there's quite a few things going on here. Pardon me. The first one here, we have this swatch of color that if you click in or drag around, we can actively change the color of the part in real time. So what's going on here? When you first launch KeyShot or based off of a fresh install, we have RGB values to begin with. This is a bit of a personal preference, but I do find RGB values very unintuitive and somewhat slow to work with. So I switched to HSV, which stands for hue, saturation, and value. So here's how these work. We have a color band on the right. This is our hue slider. So this is our basic overall color. You can click and drag left to right, or you can type in a precise value if you know what you want to start out with. Now, our saturation, the next line item down here, is going to be how much on a scale from 0 to 100% of this color is available. So this is like the amount of that color. Bring it down to 0, we are desaturated, we have no color. If we bring it to the right, we have up to 100% of that color saturation. And you'll notice up in the swatch above here, the gradient swatch, we get a left to right movement. So if this were a graph, this is like using the saturation slider is like moving along the x-axis. Finally, we have our value slider, which in KeyShot can be a number of things. Value could be a numerical value. It could also mean a color value. So when we're talking about colors, it's the amount in a percentage from 0 to 100 of white that is present in that color. So if you want to add brightness or white, you drag it to the right. If you want to reduce the brightness or the white value, you drag it to the left. This is also equivalent to having a value of 0 and a value of 1 if you bring it to the right, in case you advanced users want to use value to control other parameters within KeyShot. But that's a topic for another time. So at this point, our value slider, again, is kind of the brightness, and it moves up and down on the, or I should say it's the lightness, not the brightness. It moves up and down on the y-axis if this were a graph. So now that we've broken that down, you should get an understanding of how to manipulate your colors both up here using sliders or down here on each one of these channels. And this allows us to very quickly and easily communicate. You know, somebody says, desaturate a little and lighten it up a little. You know how to do that quickly, whereas with RGB values, that's very cumbersome. All right. Next, we also have these two swatches up top, new and old. This is going to show us the difference between these two in case we want to compare and make some subtle adjustments. Down below, we have our color palette. There are quick access colors that are very commonly used. And we also have a bunch of white swatches, which we can replace with whichever color we are working with. The reason this is super nice is I will drag down a color here if I know I'm going to use it somewhere else. Maybe I have a couple of unlinked textures materials that I want to receive this color, or maybe I want to reference it, or maybe I've got a couple different materials like a plastic and then a glass and then a metal that I want to be the same matching color. I will keep this in my palette and then it will be there for future reference. Oh, before I close that, I should cover the eyedropper. This is our, so when you click the eyedropper, you can sample a color on screen and it will pull from anywhere on screen. So if you go onto a website or if you want to reference somebody's logo, color, or anything like that, we can do that here just by clicking, and then it will sample that color and you can use it however you wish, which is really handy. Now that last bit where I was talking about reverse color lookup or find nearest perceptual color, I want to talk about that real quick. So when we move from our materials tab to our colors library, we have collections of colors. We've got some basic ones, some metals, some warm ones. We also have standard collections that come from either Pantone or RAL. And if I am on, or if I have one of these libraries selected, we see up here there's a crosshairs kind of logo. When we hover over it, our tooltip says find perceptual nearest color in selected group. So it tells me I can use this tool to sample a color, and then it'll sort through this whole group to find the nearest matches. So when I click this button, we get our color picker. Well, all we have to do is grab that eyedropper tool, sample a color, and as soon as I hit OK, it's going to search this library and filter out the closest matches. So I'll hit OK, and there are our yellow options, the ones that are closest in value. And so when you know that a vendor or anyone else says that you have a certain library to work within, this is a fast way to match your exploratory designs to real world values and colors. And then if you hover over that color later, it's going to give you that call out instead of RGB or HSV values for this. All right, so I'll bet a few of you were surprised there were that many little tools jammed into what you could call the color picker. Hopefully that's the case. So getting on with the presentation, we have next our in-project materials list, arguably one of the most helpful materials-related features we're going to touch on today. And what this is going to be is just a list of the materials that are currently applied to the geometry within your KeyShot scene. We can filter it down to show certain items, and then it can be also used to do things like make selections, link or consolidate materials, as well as bulk saving materials to your library. And we'll take a look at that real quick. So where is this to begin with? Well, you can access it from two locations. One, if you are in the Scene tab of your project panel, and we close these accordions here, and I move on over to the sub-tab called Materials. This is going to show us materials within our scene. So this is the in-scene material list. We can view it as thumbnails, and we can adjust the size of those, of course, but we can also go to the list view, which I personally prefer because if you have a long name to a material, this allows you to see it quickly and sort through it. And then also you have your material type, which I think is tremendously helpful. So if this were a model I was working on and I wanted to make sure there were no, materials that had yet to receive a KeyShot material, I could see that anything with diffuse has yet to receive a KeyShot material. So I could go about, and if I wanted to know exactly what that material was, I could left click on it, right click, and then choose Select Parts with Material. And so we should see an orange outline around the part that has been selected. Now this tells me that it's probably some item buried underneath the display. If you want to see which one of these are, let's say you want to move one of these around or find out which is which, you could right click and say Select Part with Material. And now this tells me it's this first button up here. And so if I wanted to find out if I could go ahead and link materials, you could also see if you have a bunch of duplicates here, like there's a good chance these three black diffuse ones are not being used for anything currently. So I could right click, do a link, and if I don't see a big change here on my model, I have now consolidated part of my scene. I could probably do the same for these guys right here. And then even though these look the same, the reason I would not link these here is because I know for a fact that I've got this kind of, let's turn off our depth of field here. I've got this anisotropic reflection that has some very particular swirls going on, this kind of item that we're used to seeing on certain machine parts. And I know that if I were to link these, there is a chance that that texture might move around it to a place I do not want it to. So for now, I will leave those unlinked. A couple other things we could do with these. We could, do everything from editing material to copying it, renaming it. We could re-render these thumbnails if our lighting scene has changed a bunch and we want to update their appearance. We can turn them into multi-materials. And then select parts with material. If you have a number of parts, like for instance, this material right here, if I were to, let's see which one this is our plastic here. So if I went into this guy and I did a right click select and say select parts with material, we can see that our orange outlines affect 1, 2, 3, 4 different parts. So even if, by doing this, this basically tells me that all the parts that have this material on it are linked. So there's a lot of information we can learn from within this list. Now, finally, I will say, if I were to look back into my materials list, into my custom folder, let's say I wanted to save these. I have a watch folder here. I could just grab all these and drag them into my folder for a quick bulk save. And then now it says, okay, well, you've already got this. Do I want to overwrite it? I will probably say no. And in that case, it makes a duplicate with a number 1 after the name. But there we go. Nice, quick, easy bulk save. And then you can also access this list of in-scene materials underneath your materials tab here as well. So lots of good stuff with that list. All right, we're going to speed things along a little bit in the interest of time. So linking and unlinking, this is a fairly simple concept, so I'm not going to spend too much time on here. But basically, when two parts or have a material that is linked, then they will update if you adjust the properties of that material. So when we unlink a material, then you have duplicates of that exact same material. And then if you make a change or edit to one of them, then other parts that have the same material applied that are not linked will be unaffected by that change. And in practice, it is a lot simpler than this seems if you were to read all these words. So let's go ahead and demo this. I'm going to switch to a studio that has no materials applied. So right here, if we go ahead and look at this guy, we can see that, in fact, every single part within our scene is unlinked currently and just has a gray diffuse material. So let's talk about how we can get around this. I'm going to find some materials. So if I've got a glass, I'll go ahead and throw that on the face of this watch here. And then if I've got my plastic, maybe I want to apply it to the band here. Let's go ahead and make it black. And I'm going to throw this into performance mode so we don't get all the graininess here. And to really quickly start populating this, what I can do is use some keyboard shortcuts. Shift left click is going to copy the material. So I've shift left clicked on this part, and I can use shift and then right click on another part, and now it has pasted that material onto it. What it has also done simultaneously is linked them. And we know that because in our in-scene material list, we only have one black material, yet two parts have a black material on it. So let's say we wanted to paste that black material onto these other bands, but we did not want them linked. We would use Shift, Control, or Command, and right-click on the remaining parts. And you see now we have 3 black plastics in our in-scene material list. Then, of course, if we wanted to link those, we would select one, hold Shift, and then select the other one. Right-click, link materials, and it will collapse these. So now they are all linked together. So there's not a way to unlink them from here. But in most cases, when I'm linking materials within my in-scene material list, it's done in order to consolidate a list and simplify my scene. So now if I were to make a slight change to the color of the wristband, I can go ahead and do so, and it's going to change on the entire watch. Pretty cool. And then if I were to grab one of my guys here, I'm going to say, no, I don't want to link these. KeyShot 7 is also more intelligent, and it actually asks you if you wish to link materials when it notices that there's something in the scene with that applied to it already. And in this case, KeyShot is looking at the fact that I have another studio, and it's saying, well, you've already used this in this other studio. Do you want to link them? And I said no. So we can go about linking and unlinking. We can also, let's say we want to, I'll go ahead and apply this guy here, and I'll go ahead and use the same approach to copy and paste materials. And then if I wanted to, say, unlink something, so I've got all these different bands and they're all part of the same material, I could click on one to select it. And I'll remind you real quick, if you're not in our scene tab, we don't get our orange outlines here. So once I select something, I can right click and do an unlink material. And again, we now have 2 of the same thing, and we can make changes to it. So if you wanted to, the reasons you would unlink materials depends on if you want to make some changes, or if maybe you want some labels to be on one material but not on another part of the same material. So there's a lot of things we can do there. All right, let's see what we have back here. So again, these at the bottom were just a list of the keyboard shortcuts I showed you. And once you memorize these, you will work through a KeyShot scene much, much faster. Now let's talk about isolate materials to selection. And this is a very interesting feature. It's also a new feature for KeyShot. We can create a new group of linked materials within a selection, which sounds maybe a little confusing, but I can show you exactly what that looks like. There's a number of scenarios where this might make sense, and the more complicated your scene or the more parts your scene may have, the more likely you are to use this feature, I think. So let me go ahead and copy. So right now we've got the face of this watch, or sorry, the bezel of this watch, 3 buttons, and 2 parts for the clasp on this watch that all share the same material right now. So if I wanted to then separate these 3 buttons from this selection of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 parts, what I would do is I would select one to begin with. Oops. Again, I just want those orange outlines so you guys can see that. And I'm going to hold Control, select all 3 of those, and when I right click and say isolate materials to selection, we now have a different or a copy of that material. And if I were to go about changing one of the values on here, there we go. So if I were to change this to be more of, I don't know, a silver, we could do that, and now these remain linked together, and there's also the parts that were originally linked. So we're not, unlinking and then relinking a whole bunch of things. So it's just a faster way to work once again. Now let's talk about saving materials, because this is often a point of confusion. When you start making edits to a material in KeyShot, people always ask me, is this changing the material that we have in our library? And the answer is no. We make it pretty difficult for you to override or change that library material. But of course, if you really need to, there is a way. What I want to do is talk about just sort of the implications and things around saving materials. So, and then of course, there are features that we will talk about that require you to have certain materials saved to your library if you want to use that feature. So for instance, let's say that I'll pull this out of performance mode. So let's say that we're liking the appearance of this watch band, and I want to save this then to my library. Well, if we look over here, it says matte black number 3. That's not terribly descriptive. The first thing I do before considering saving a material to my library, which I did not do when we originally dragged all these materials over to my folder, was renaming it so it's actually going to reflect what its appearance. So in this case, this would be, I would say, like a, I don't know, matte pistachio. Hopefully I spelled that right. But this is kind of like this light green kind of pale sort of green color. And then once we save this, it's going to ask where. Of course, I want this to go into my custom folder, and then we can save it. Now, if you save a material, let's say I make a different color. Let's go darker. And let's say I go to save this again. It's going to say, hey, you already have this material in your library. Do you want to overwrite it? We can update it, yes or no, and then it's going to make a duplicate with an extra number next to it. So we see that there's a different version of it down here now. And then, so that little warning that it gives you prevents you from overwriting any KeyShot materials as well. And so let's go ahead and look at some other items. I mentioned it must be in, so the reason you would want to save KeyShot materials to the library is if you're going to use them again in the future, whether it's in another KeyShot file or another KeyShot scene, or if maybe you're making folders based on projects or product lines or clients that you have, you can save materials to those for future use and keep them kind of organized that way. If you are just using KeyShot materials that are stock, that are in the KeyShot library, in the default KeyShot installer, and you are not making custom changes to them, don't bother saving them back into the library, because it's just going to make a duplicate of something that's always going to be there anyway. And then of course, if you're going to use features such as apply materials on import, which I'll talk about in a bit, as well as material templates, those materials you wish to be applied to the model must be in your key. It could be in the materials folder, or it could be in a custom location that you've specified, as we talked about doing earlier. Now, let's talk about some KeyShot Pro features. We're going to look at multi-materials next. So multi-materials are a great feature that was introduced to KeyShot 7, which allows you to show different variations of a material or a product. So you could show 3 different colors of plastic, or you could show how something ships if it was cast in aluminum, or powder coated, or sprayed with a metallic paint. So there's a lot of different things. We could also use materials to have a consistent material on a part, but show different logos or labels or things like that, or different aging. You know, you could show a product when it's brand new, then you can show a product after it has some scratches on it, and then you can show it when it's completely destroyed, based on switching out multi-materials. So what is a multi-material? Well, we convert regular materials into a multi-material, and once it becomes a multi-material, it contains sub-materials. Yeah, I know this can sound confusing, but think of it like this. If your multi-material is a box full of cans of spray paint, then each of your sub-materials is each different can of spray paint. A multi-material is kind of like a container, and then you can save it to your library, and then once you paste it or place it onto another piece of geometry, then all those sub-materials come with it. And I'll show you what that looks like. And then, of course, there's a great little hotkey that allows you to cycle through these materials. So let's turn the wristband of this watch into a multi-material. And actually, I will switch back on over to our other studio over here, just because it's a little easier on the eyes, I feel. And then I'm also going to disable depth of field. Let's go ahead and bring this watch band to a darker color. Alrighty. So let's turn this band into a few different options here with the multi-material. So if I go ahead and double click on it, we are in our materials property tab. We see the button called multi-material, and it's right to the right of the material graph button. So when I click this, we get a list, and we love lists in KeyShot 7 because it's how the new KeyShot has become so flexible. And this is one thing that you can tie into studios as well, which is really cool. So back on the multi-material item, what I can do is, let's say I want to do another color, so maybe it ships in black, and then maybe there's going to be a gray version. Well, I can either add a blank new plastic, or I can duplicate this material, and in which case, that's what I want to do. So I'm going to duplicate this material, and I'm going to change the color, which we can do by using our color picker, or just grabbing a color from our color library. I'll choose a gray, maybe it's a little light, go mid-gray. And then I will rename this, which you can do with a double click. Oopsies. And then this one here, maybe I just want to have the color as the name. So these are sub-materials, and this whole material is called the multi-material at this point. Now, if we had a logo or a label on here, or maybe some textures, one thing that we could do to simplify our life, especially if we're going to get into the material graph and start editing nodes, we can consolidate nodes by choosing this option, which is duplicate material and link textures. So what that will do is actually give you a few different materials in which the same single texture node feeds into, which, again, take my word for it, it will clean up your material graph later when you get to that point. But let's say we want to also ship this in a transparent material. So maybe I'm going to do, so let's see if we let's just search for a glass, even though, no, this would not be made of glass. We can still drag this in here and get an idea if this was kind of this plastic band. And then maybe I just want to make it, yeah. I think this will work. So at this point, we have like a black, a gray, and then we'll call this trans orange. So we have our transparent orange object. And then if we hold Shift and B, we can cycle through these, which is a great little shortcut to show these off at any point during a working session. If someone comes over your shoulder, you can just start cycling through these and they can see what you're working with. Now, of course, the last thing I would do is I would rename this, because this no longer is descriptive of what's going on with these different materials. I would usually name this something like watch band, MM for multi-material, so I know what it is. And then I would probably just save this into my custom folder, or maybe my watch folder. And now, if I were to go into that watch folder and find my multi-material, if I were to apply this to, say, another part, no, I don't want to link them, and I hit Shift B, I can actually cycle through those on the band, but I can also cycle through the other multi-material here. And then, of course, we could link all these together. So I could look at my in-project material list and take the watch band and the duplicate and link those. One thing I did not call out, which is if you have two different materials, how do you know which is going to link to the other? So for example, if I have the bezel of this watch here, and let's see. So if I go ahead and select part with material, we've got the bezel of this watch. It's this last chrome one down here. And then I've got the hard, rough plastic for the body. So if I want to turn the body of this into the same matching metal, I would choose the polished metal first, and then I would select the black plastic that I want to link it to, and then right-click and choose Link Materials. Now they become the same material. Conversely, if I wanted the bezel of the watch to become plastic, I would choose the plastic first, then the bezel of the watch, and then link those, and it goes the opposite direction. So remember, the first material you click is the one that is going to determine the appearance of the other ones that you then link it to. So sorry, I forgot that one. I didn't mean to go out of order there, but that's a good one to know. All right, so we have talked about multi-materials. I don't think there's anything else there. If I remember it later, though, we will come back to it. Let's see. So let's talk about linked materials and how they affect our model sets. This is another pro feature. Model sets is one of the key ingredients to having or creating studios, just like multi-materials were. So when we create a new model set, we have the option to link materials. And what that means is the model set you create from the currently active model set will have linked materials with the one that was previously selected. So let me show you what that means. If I were to create a new model set while we are actively on the painted up model set, if I hit create new model set, and let's say I just want to copy in, let's say we just want to copy some of these parts, maybe just the bezel assembly, I don't know. And then I'm going to call this bezel. Now I have this option here to link materials. And if I do this, then if I were to make a change to the bezel in either one of these painted up or the model set I'm making now, we will see the change carried over across both of them. So if I say link and I hit OK, we are now in the new model set with just the bezel. And if I were to adjust the color of this, let's just go crazy, some bright color. And then we can go back to the other model set. There we go. It is updated. So you have to come up with a game plan early on if you want to link those or not, because of course we can also use our multi-materials, as we talked about before, to control variation in material appearance throughout your KeyShot scene. We could, of course, though, go into here, select, unlink. Now if I were to go back into here and make a change, we could get back to something like that, and we should see that our bezel has not changed. And of course, we can render a new thumbnail for that bezel there. So hopefully this is starting to clear up the relationship between linked and unlinked materials and how it affects different parts of your KeyShot scene. So here, one thing I called out was do not link materials across model sets if one of your configurations or a state requires unique materials. And the example I give here is, let's say we did an exploded diagram and then we wanted to color code certain parts to call out, like maybe in this case it was to replace part of your watch band. You might do an exploded view and then you want to make one thing red or a pin red if you want to explode that, so people know what's going on. And then in that case, I would do a model set for each part of the instruction process, and I would not link materials, therefore allowing the flexibility to change all of those materials as needed to help communicate what we're talking about. And then there's I guess another thing you could do is, if you linked them to begin with and then you didn't want to do that, you could individually unlink them like I did, or you could multi-select and link or isolate to a selection as well if those are linked materials. Maybe that's getting a little too down the rabbit hole. Let's talk about material templates real quick, because they're a massive time saver once you have created them. Now, unfortunately, right now, I do not have a fully functional CAD model to show this whole thing in action 100%. However, it's quite easy, and I will talk you through how you go about doing this. The first thing that we want to do is go into our window and find our material templates. And right here, there's a new dialog that says material templates, and there's nothing in there yet because I have not created any. So the way material templates work and what they do is, let's say we modeled this in CAD, and in our CAD application, we specified materials on each part. And we knew that this was going to be an anisotropic material, like anisotropic radial. Maybe this is a glass, maybe this is a nylon band. And basically we can choose colors to differentiate those, or we could write the name of those materials, or name those materials specifically in CAD so they correspond with a KeyShot material. So what we can do using a material template is, you can tell KeyShot, hey, anytime you see this shade of blue, apply polished chrome to it or something similar. So the way this is done is you start by creating a template or adding a template, and there's two methods. There's the manual method or the automatic method. Manual is kind of more for an advanced user, but more for somebody who wants complete control over every material translation. And then within each of these directions, so we're going to just look at automatic today. And within these, we can choose part or material. So let's make sure this is clear. If I were to choose part, I would be looking at the name, the item name, to then influence the material that is applied to the part. So each one of these names becomes crucial when working off of parts. If we go the material route, it's going to actually look at the name of the material as specified on the part within the CAD application. And so depending on whether you manage, within the workspace, you could basically work off of part or material, but this comes down to preferences usually based on if you're using a PDM or whatever CAD library you're using. Sometimes you don't have control over a part's color or a part's name, so we give you the options to use one or the other. So in this case, if I were to use material, and I could call this, call it Sport Watch. So maybe I am creating 5 or 6 different models and I want them to all have the same materials applied automatically when I import them into KeyShot. I would say okay. So it's actually made the template right there. So if I go to template rules, we actually see a full list of different items, and the source is the color or the name of that color or material that was applied to it in the CAD application, And then it looks at what we chose to apply in KeyShot, and it's going to do a translation. It's going to say, when I see this, I apply this. When I see this source color or material, I apply this KeyShot material. And so you can then further customize these, as mentioned, the manual method if you want to use wildcards or add variables. And then now that this has been created, if we had imported, say, another watch, or we had a different model set, we could then apply this automatically to it, and it would paint up our part, making for quite a bit of time savings, especially on more complex assemblies, of course. And I will say, if you are going to use material templates, as mentioned before, you want to make sure that all the new materials in this list are indeed saved to your KeyShot library, or it will not work. Same for somebody who is to open or apply a material template on their machine, someone other than you. You would want to make sure that they have all those materials in their library as well. All right. So that is pretty much it on material templates. And then before we get into the Q&A, something I remembered here, I'm going to throw one more little feature or example your way. I will go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and just close down KeyShot. I'm not going to save it. I'm going to relaunch KeyShot, and I'm going to import one more model because there's a cool feature called apply materials on import. So if I go and find this Rhino file and I drag this into KeyShot, we have some options. Let's just open all these up. All right, so we have the option to assign materials from library, which is interesting. So this is one of those things that if you don't spend time looking at your import, you might have missed historically. And I highly recommend you take a look at this. If you're using a CAD application and you have already named or applied materials based on KeyShot library materials, this is going to work like a material template on its own. So when I hit import, it's going to import this ring, and you saw for a split second we saw those diffuse colors, that yellow and some other stuff, but then KeyShot looked in the library and it found that we had something called gemstone sapphire, gold 24 karat polished, and platinum polished. These were the actual material names that were applied to that ring inside Rhino. And then when we brought it into KeyShot, lo and behold, it saw those in our library and it automatically applied them because we checked the right box when I imported this part. So whether or not you have material templates, you can use this function here, and it behaves quite similarly, but is just a little bit less flexible. So on that, I will switch back over to our splash screen here, take some Q&A. And then if I need to demo anything out, I might open up that watch scene one more time. But basically, that's all I wanted to share with you today on materials. Hopefully this gives you a good understanding of how to manage a scene, manage materials, as well as a bunch of little tips and tricks and tools to help you become a KeyShot ninja. And if you guys got to get going, thank you for stopping by, and have a good one.
Cool, thanks, Will. Yeah, I also wanted to mention that we do have a quick tip on the multi-material. So if that was an interesting topic to any of you guys, you can jump on our YouTube page and watch a little more in-depth quick tip on the multi-material and how that's used. Something I believe that you missed, Will, was the in-project materials list filtering options. Would you mind just touching on those?
Yeah, great call. So I'm going to go ahead and get back in here. So it will also make sense if I have a more complicated, more complex scene. So I'm going to open up the one with the watch that we had just a bit ago and show that off. So if we go into my studio and I switch them out to the other one, back to my project, go to my materials list. We have a lot of materials because this is showing everything in the KeyShot scene, which means both of my model sets materials are showing up here. But if I want to filter this down, Rex pointed out there's a great option here in the bottom right to filter either by model set, which now cuts that pretty much in half because we don't see those items that are not being shown anymore because the other model set is not active. Or we can go by visibility. In this case, that produces the same result. But if we had certain parts hidden or turned off in the scene tree, we would then minimize or reduce the number of materials listed in this in-scene materials list. So yeah, thanks for calling that one out, Rex.
Cameron is asking or mentioning that materials look much different in different lighting environments. What do you recommend to get consistent coloring across different lighting environments?
Yeah, okay, that's a decent question. So just to make sure I'm not answering the wrong question, their scenario is that they've added, if we go to my environments, we see that my environments for these two were identical. But if I were to, say, add, I don't know, something pretty drastically different here, and then your question is something like this, now it no longer looks correct. Is that kind of what the premise is? Okay. So in this case, I don't have a hard, fast rule or a silver bullet solution for this question or challenge, if you will. Now that I've said that, I would say that I try to practice consistency as best as I can. So I will always, you can develop your own habits, but I am very, very used to working with this 3-panel environment as my basic starting default environment. And the reason I do so is because I think it offers the most, it's a good amount of contrast, creates some decent highlights and shadows and reflections. And then I move from there. So if I find, I call that kind of like my basic starting point. So I find that if it looks good in this environment, it will look good in most, but once I've set the materials to look good in this environment, I don't tend to change them much after that. So in the example that I had, that outdoor scene, now that I like my materials the way they are, if I have this kind of outdoor scene here and it's not matching, I would probably go about tweaking this environment to bring it a little bit closer to the other studio environment. If you knew you were going to do a primary shot of your product in a few drastically different environments, I'd probably start with them all in the same kind of studio environment, and then from there, I might go into my library with my watch and I might make another folder where I then work on the corresponding collection of materials that work best in this environment to retain that appearance. So that's my long way of saying that there's no magic button that does this for you. You absolutely have to put in some work if you're going to retain the total same appearance, but there's no way that you can expect a lighting environment that changes drastically to not drastically change the appearance of your materials. Hopefully that is at least brings a little bit of clarity. I don't know if you would have any other recommendations, Rex.
I do have something else to add to that, pardon me, is that the use of multi-materials and studios can be very helpful in this type of case. I've seen a situation where maybe we're rendering this watch in a straight-on orthographic view, and then we have it at kind of a 3/4 view like you see here. But because of the metal material and how sensitive it is to the reflections of the environment, it might look maybe much darker when you're viewing it at the straight-on orthographic than you are in the 3/4 view, when really the environment hasn't changed at all. It's just a subtle difference in rotation. So in that kind of case, I've used multi-materials. So you might have a multi-material or a sub-material for the front view or for orthographic, and then one for the 3/4 view. And then you can create a studio for each of those and toggle between the two, so that if you have to render out those two final images, you can very quickly toggle between them to ensure that they have a consistent appearance.
Yeah, I love that. No, that's an absolutely great example. And hopefully we can touch or show or walk through that on one of the upcoming webinars, because it's kind of like an extension of this one. Once you start getting into these lists, they kind of bleed into building out studios and you can do a ton of fantastic stuff with that. So I really like that solution. Very nice.
And then, yeah, just another note on the isolate materials to selection. I've seen that very useful when working with model sets. So maybe you have 3 different variations of this watch in one model set, and you create another model set where you'll want to maybe just adjust the color of the band only, but retain all the other materials. You can create that new model set while linking all the materials to make sure if you're tweaking, then it stays consistent between the model sets. And then you can select that band material in the in-project list. You say select materials by part, or select parts by material, and that'll be specific to that model set. So you're not selecting any other parts in other model sets. And then you can say isolate materials to selection, tweak the color of that band, and that way you have that flexibility to control that, but it still keeps all of those materials linked together within the model set.
That's pretty cool. Definitely some nice stuff there. I like that recommendation.
Cool. Well, hopefully that makes sense to people listening in.
Yeah, and like we said, if it doesn't, then stay tuned for more webinars. I'm sure we'll be getting into some more like advanced scene management stuff in the future as well.